Welcome to UnityNow, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
And welcome back to the Unity Now podcast. My guest today is Connor Boyack, the founder and president of the Libertas organization. He's going to talk about that and probably a lot of things. Today is October 28th, and Elon Musk just took over Twitter, so I've got to ask him about that as well. Connor, welcome.
Thanks, Toby, for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you for your time. We know you have a lot of things going on. Obviously, with your background there, there's a lot of things you have to go through with that brainstorm you have behind you.
Yep.
So, yeah, as I told you, we told the audience before we got started about a little bit about your bio and your background. But if you could tell us a little more about your background in starting Libertas Institute and how you got to that.
So, I used to be a web developer, but had developed this passion for learning that I didn't really get in school. I was not a good student. I didn't enjoy a lot of subjects like history and economics and English and all these subjects I did poorly in. But after college, I really enjoyed learning a lot. I was reading a lot, and I kind of developed a bit of a skill set for making a difference. I was getting involved in some political campaigns with some nonprofits, and I decided I really enjoyed doing that, even though it was nights and weekends. I wanted to figure out how I could do this as a full-time thing and be, kind of someone trying to push for change in my community on a daily basis rather than just sporadically on top of, work, family, and other obligations. So I started our organization as a think tank about a decade, 11 years ago now, and really is an effort to focus more at a state and local level. One of my concerns at the time, and still, is that a lot of us pay attention to national things. We're talking about them, we're watching the news, we're shaking our fists. We're very fixated on like national or international things where we can't really affect any significant change at all. And so our attention gravitates towards the very area or level of government that we can impact the least. And I felt like, look, hardly anyone's paying attention to local government or state issues. And maybe if we focus there, we can actually make some good progress, move some things forward. So that's what our organization, Libertas Institute, was started to do, is be this like state level think tank that could actually focus on consensus ideas. We're kind of more libertarian or free market, but we focus on ideas that have, I would say, broad appeal to left and right and everyone in between, because we're really trying to drive solutions forward that aren't part of this like, dialectic battle of like, one side versus the other side, where it's this, back and forth of the policy gets passed and then it gets repealed when the next party comes into power. Like, we're trying to find ideas that have broad consensus so that no matter who's in power or which party the sponsor is from or anything like that, our proposals remain in law, can actually make an impact over the long term. So that's kind of the sweet spot where we work.
That's great to hear. Yeah, and I would agree with what you said about national things versus local things usually. And do you think in the last year or so, national, like the president thing, what's doing and the Congress is doing, is now kind of, affecting local states a little more now? Or what do you think about those conversations now?
The federal government always, impacts state and local governments. Oftentimes Congress will pass a law and then they'll threaten to withhold funds from states if they don't comply or if they don't, voluntarily participate in this, program. So there's always been this tension where whatever Congress is doing is impacting state and local governments. Where we try and work is, you know, areas where the federal government isn't kind of, throwing its weight around or driving, people into, for example, I fly a lot. I do a lot of public speaking around the country. And
Okay.
so I remember going to the airport about a year ago, and they had this sign up that says, your driver's license, you're not going to be allowed to fly unless your driver's license has this yellow star on it. And I was like, what the
It's a
heck is
real
this? I look and
ID.
I
Yeah.
realize, yeah, it's the real ID, which in 2007, people across the political spectrum freaked out about this concept of a national ID, the left and the, left from civil liberties, the right from a, limited government perspective. Everyone pushed back, and Congress pulled it back. They kind of dropped it. And yet in the decades since, they have fully implemented Real ID by going slowly and incrementally, and also by basically bribing states into compliance with funding and grants, where they've been able to get them to adopt piecemeal what we now fully have. The driver's license in my wallet has the yellow star. It's a Real ID compliant ID now. And so that to me is an area where we need a lot more people at the state and local level pushing back, because eventually all the kind of corrupt machinery of DC is very much going to push its way onto our communities if we don't, stand up and try and push back against some of it.
That's a good example. That makes sense. Yeah. Um, and on your bio, your institute got 80% with some new laws or things like that. Can you give the audience an example of one of the landmark policy changes that Libertas has helped to shape?
Sure. I'll share one of the more recent ones. So everyone's familiar with, Uber and Lyft and the battles they've had with the taxi industry, or Airbnb with, hotels or local governments, or like Tesla, even in Utah where I live and many other states. It was illegal at first for Tesla to sell its cars because they didn't sell through car dealerships. They went direct to consumer. And many of the states, the car dealers over the years had gotten laws passed to say you have to sell cars through car dealerships, and so Tesla's model was at first illegal. They had, in our state, they had to go to the Supreme Court and really, push their way forward. But look, if you're Uber and Lyft, or if you're Elon Musk or whatever, you're very well capitalized. You've got a lot of money. You can buy a lot of lobbyists. You can, muscle your way through and still get what you want, which is why we have
Right.
Uber and Lyft and Teslas and everything else. What about the little guy? What about the guy who's sitting at his kitchen table on the back of the napkin? He's like, I got this business idea. He looks into it and it's like, oh, that's against the law. Okay, I'll keep working at Starbucks or, whatever it is. So we got a law passed called a regulatory sandbox. And if any of your listeners know, like from the IT world, again, I used to be a web developer, a sandbox environment is a computer server where you can test your code out before you do a full, deployment into the app store or into the real world. It's a way to kind of a safe space, if you will, to test what you're
Yeah.
doing. A regulatory sandbox is somewhat similar. Let's say, uh, I come up with this new invention and it's illegal because of this particular regulation. Well, I can say, hang on, why don't you suspend that regulation for 1 or 2 years and allow me in this little pilot project to still develop it, go to market, test it. Everything, there'll be transparency and reporting. And if there's any complaints or lawsuits or harm or anything like that, we can shut it down. But this is a way to kind of incrementally go forward without having to go do this big fight and hire a bunch of lobbyists and try and muscle your way forward. So it kind of levels the playing field so that the little guy can be innovative and entrepreneurial. If there's
Right.
some law from 30 years ago that kind of stands in their way, now they have the ability to say, hey, let's get this resolved. Let's test out what it would look like to reduce that regulation, or have it not apply to this particular circumstance. So we got the country's first regulatory sandbox passed in Utah, and now we've helped over 20 states pass sandbox laws like this,
Wow.
to make sure that a lot of entrepreneurs and businesses and so forth have a lot more flexibility, especially like post COVID. A lot of people were. I remember here in my state there was I think they were like a brewery or something, making kind of small batches of non-alcoholic drinks, and they pivoted into hand sanitizer when things exploded with COVID at the beginning. But there were all of
Yeah.
these regulations that they never anticipated, so they had to shut it down and go back to what they were doing. So really just trying to say, can we be more flexible with entrepreneurs, level the playing field so not just the rich people can muscle their way through, but help the little guy as well. So that's just one example of some of the work that our organization does.
So that, yeah, I'm from not the IT world, but my day job is with some EDM stuff, and for a solution with, storing digital documents and things like that. And so I understand the sandbox. So you're saying that basically they can try out this new idea, this new solution, whatever it may be, with no regulations in this little sandbox environment. What have been the results? Have there been anything? Have there, anything that have gone through this process and come through the end of it yet?
Yeah, there's a variety of examples I could share. I'll share one that comes to mind or the top of mind. There's a company in a few states called Homey. They are a real estate kind of app where you can buy and sell homes through an app. Makes it super easy, far more affordable than your traditional realtor process. Even though it's actual realtors you're working with, they've just made it far more efficient so that they can have scale and then lower the cost for people. Well, in our state, there was a battle a while back between the realtors and the title. I think it was the title companies, and the legislature passed a law that said, well, if you own both, you can't refer more than 70% of your own clients to your own title company. In other words, you can't just keep it in the family. You have to refer business out to other title companies. Well, of course, Homey, they want to keep everything in the family so that they can, maximize their profits and then lower their costs to pull even more people in because it's an attractive product. So because they're forced to give leads to other people, they're basically being forced to help their competitors. So they came into the sandbox and they're like, hey, look, like that particular law, that 70% thing is problematic for us and it inhibits our innovative approach. Can we get that suspended for a year and thereby have 100% of our, business stay within our little ecosystem? And we'll provide reports and we'll show what's going on, and we'll be able to show policymakers like it's not the end of the world, like we're saving money for consumers and here's how
Yeah.
much they like it, and there's been no lawsuits or no complaints. So it's a very micro targeted way to kind of say here's a very specific regulation or a very specific law in this circumstance that doesn't quite apply or causes this problem. And rather than go have this big political battle up on the hill between people who disagree, instead, let's just try it out for a little bit and see what would actually happen. And I'll end here. Policymakers really like this because think of it. If we go do battle up on Capitol Hill, you've got, in this example, the Homey, folks versus like the title companies who want, more business referred from them. It's a big battle, and a lawmaker is caught in the middle between lobbyists for either side saying this is the greatest thing ever versus this is the worst thing ever. And it's a very low information environment. It's just claims and theories and
Yeah.
speculation about what will or won't happen. With a sandbox, we can basically do a pilot project and say, hey, lawmaker, like we tried this out for a year. Here's what actually happened. Now you can make a more informed decision. So the lawmakers are gobbling up this idea because they recognize how often they're required to make decisions without much or any information. And this is a process where we can say you can be far smarter about your regulations based on actual data that we're generating from these companies.
That can almost filter out the lawmakers that aren't interested in actually saying if this something works, right?
Right.
What kind of pushback do you get from something like that, or just nationally on these policy changes you're trying to make, either from the right or the left? I'm curious what kind of environment you navigate with this organization.
So in this particular example, it passed unanimously in our legislature. Democrats like this. because it helps the little guy. It's not just for the wealthy, mega millionaire entrepreneurs to get their way. This can level the playing field, as I said. So they kind of like it from a socioeconomic perspective of really creating opportunities for, lower income people to have a seat at the table, if you will. The Republicans really like it because it's, cutting red tape and lowering regulations that don't make sense and things like that. So what our organization typically does is, because we're trying to find those consensus ideas a lot, we try and pitch what we're doing in terms that are attractive to each side. Like, what's a win for you and what's a win for you? What do you care about? Oh, well, here's how this actually serves you. This is how it's actually aligned with what you're doing. One of our projects in the past, unsuccessfully so far, has been to repeal the death penalty in our state. We firmly believe that the state should not have the ability to execute its own citizens. Well, when we're talking to Democrats, we'll use very different talking points, so to speak, than when we're talking to conservatives. Right? For the conservatives, it's like, you don't trust the post office to deliver your mail. Why are you trusting the government to get it right? Because sometimes innocent people are executed. And then, of course, when we're talking to people on the so-called left, we're using very different talking points. For them, it's like, look, it's, Black people who are disproportionately executed. If you're a, white middle-class person or doing better than that, you have good attorneys who are going to make sure you get life without parole. All the people being killed are the, poor Black people who don't have good lawyers. And so basically, we focus on issues that we firmly believe in, and then we try and identify ways to connect it to different people and their kind of values and principles in a way where we can bring all kinds of people to the table and hopefully have broader consensus than just like our little echo chamber.
Was it always like that at the Libertas Institute, or did you have to find different ways to do these policy changes?
Oh, it was not always like that.
Yeah.
I've had to learn a lot along the way. I come from a more conservative background, although I call myself a libertarian these days. But when I first started, I was kind of high and mighty. I know everything. You're all wrong. There's this comic. I should find it and print it out because it's so on point. It's this guy hunched over a computer. It's dark. The computer screen is glowing in his face, and he's hunched over the keyboard. And his wife comes in the door, into his office. Honey, it's late. Come to bed. And he turns to her and he says, "Not now. Not now, honey. Someone's wrong on the internet." And I'm like, I got to reply to them. So in my early days, I distinctly remember one time when I went up to a committee meeting and I basically told all these legislators to their face that like this bill was horrible, and they like would be doing this horrible thing if they voted for it. How dare they consider it? Like, I was very kind of brash, if you will, and I've since learned a lot about just relationship management and how to manage people's expectations, how to get what I want by helping other people get what they want, and just trying to build coalitions and work collaboratively. And it's been great. I've been able to move we've passed over 100 we've gotten over 100 laws passed. 8 or 9 of them are the first of their kind in the whole country. Won all these awards, made all this, like, it's just been great. And so, yeah, your question is awesome for me to think about, because when I reflect on my early years, I've had to learn a lot about just effective communication and negotiation and how humans operate, human psychology, just all these things to actively try and build influence rather than just stand on a soapbox and say, "You're all wrong, I'm right."
Yeah, and that makes sense with everything we found. Like, if you want to have a negotiation or a conversation with somebody who doesn't like you, it's all in the nuance with the conversation, right? So you got to be really slow and careful with talking to people that, they think you're a Democrat or a Republican, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I already know you, so I don't need to listen to you."
Right.
Well, you got to take that conversation differently. So you talk about passing a lot of those policy changes or laws. Well, it's funny you mentioned that the Libertas and Institute, which is in your libertarian, you're passing laws. Well, I thought libertarians don't want any laws, right? It's all about liberty and free everything. But so you're saying
what I tell my friends is
us.
what I tell my friend is if you want to repeal a law, you actually have to pass a law. You have to pass a bill that says this law is hereby repealed or whatever. So, I recognize that while I have, my theoretical ideas about how society should be structured, it's quite different than what we have today. So as much as anyone, enjoy fanciful political theorizing and, talking about utopian society and what that looks like. But at the end of the day, like, I'm just trying to make sure people aren't getting screwed by their own government. And our big thing is standing up for the little guy. Like in our state, we passed the country's first food truck freedom law. There were all these food truck owners going out of business because they would have to get a permit and pay all these fees in every single city they went to. And when you're going all over to different events, that adds up. It takes a ton of time. Food margins are razor thin anyways. And so all these food trucks were going out of business because they couldn't manage the overhead and it wasn't working.
I
Well,
bet.
we stepped in. We got a law passed that knocked down a lot of these regulations. Now you get one permit from your home city. You can go anywhere in the state you want. Cities can't knock you out. They can't put distance requirements like, oh, you have to be so far away from a restaurant. Like all these restrictions that cities were doing, we went to the state and said those can't happen anywhere in the state anymore. And now there's a flourishing food truck economy. People love them. They're doing great. They're, these micro entrepreneurs. A lot of them are former felons that, can't get a job, at most places. So they go start their own. Like that to me is what I love. It's like, sure, let's theorize about, the abstract whatever. But like, meanwhile, there's people that are having problems. No one's really speaking up for them. So our organization goes to try and help people like that to kind of clear those roadblocks out of the way and make sure that they can, have their pursuit of happiness, if you will.
Yeah, and that example, I mean, is that regulation really about the restaurant owners that don't want competition just showing up in front of their door, or what
I
does
would
regulation
say
like that help? Yeah.
I would say that's a very minor thing. A lot of the problems, like with this regulatory sandbox, it's that the law was passed long ago, or it's just the way that has kind of organically emerged, and no one really foresaw Uber and Lyft or Airbnb or Turo or food trucks. Like
Or food trucks, yeah.
policymakers from years past, like they just constructed things in a way that made sense at the time. But then
Yeah.
with a changing economy, it hasn't kept up. So it's less like corrupt and intentional where, people are trying to screw the innovative, whoever. It's more just that these laws are not flexible. And so eventually an innovative, like I'll give you a silly example. We passed this whole law for food trucks that I just described. Well, then in southern Utah, we just found out recently that there was a gentleman who had the idea to create a mobile haircut, like a haircut truck. Like he'd drive up to your place of business and you just kind of come out of the truck, you cut your hair, you go back into work. And so basically like a food truck for haircuts. Well,
Right.
we passed this whole law for food trucks, never anticipating other kinds of trucks. And so
Right.
his operation is still illegal because the city says, oh, you're not allowed to do it. And so we never had that intention. We never said, let's exclude all these things. It's just that we as humans can't foresee creativity and innovation. And so that's more what we run into, is that the good intentions of years and decades past run into conflict with these new emerging things. And
Yeah.
so a lot of what we do is try to like clear that out of the way so that they can move forward.
Is there even a way to set up a law or a regulation that actually can, do creativity and innovation in like 10 years? Is there any way to set up a law like that?
Well, Toby, I would argue that's exactly what our sandbox is designed to do. It's like we can't recognize what's going to happen, but we've created a process so that
Hmm.
when it happens in the future, you can just come get a temporary waiver, still, develop your business, and then let us as elected officials catch up to you, right? Because while you're doing that pilot project, we'll be gathering data. We can run a bill, we can change the law so that when you're done with the sandbox experiment, and you have to comply with the full law, we've changed the law in the meantime to allow you to move forward. So that's kind of the exact value proposition of the sandbox, is to say, because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, let's create a process where those innovative things can come in and not get shut down, but still kind of go to market, develop what they're doing, and let the government kind of catch up to the changing economy.
Very good. Yeah. And so you're started in Utah, right? And then how's it going across the nation right now and growing it?
So the way we typically work is we're first and foremost focused on our state. There's think tanks like us in most states. Some are better than others, of course. They're all different. But what we typically will do is we will create partnerships with other organizations who are operating in their states or their communities. We're not a group to go into those states and to like do the actual work like we do here in
Hmm.
Utah. Instead, we're kind of a behind the scenes supporter to a lot of these groups. It could be you know, uh, you know, right of center think tanks. It could be ACLU chapters. It could be parents groups. It could be individual legislators themselves who are like, hey, I want to work on that in my state, and we'll go, help them. And so we just create a lot of partnerships where we can say like, okay, here's legislation, here's research, here's talking points, here's polling numbers, here's videos, here's, whatever you need. Tell us how we can help you, and so we can kind of extend our impact by, propping up other people, make them look good, in their community, help them get a win. And then it's kind of a win-win approach where they look good, we help people, we, fix things. And so it's actually going really well. There's been legislation at the federal level introduced on this sandbox idea, which is ultimately where it's really needed because a lot of the regulations that business owners struggle with are federal regulations and not state. So we can clear up some of the state stuff, but the ultimate win for us is getting a federal sandbox. And so we're just barely getting started on trying to see that happen.
That's great to hear. Excuse me. Um, and so now you're an author and a TV producer as well, right? Tell us about the
Yes.
Tuttle Twins series and how that all started and what kind of problems you're trying to solve with that.
So when I was a few years into this think tank thing, my kids at the time were 5 and 3. And, as any good dad would do, I would come home at the end of the day and I'd ask my son, my 5-year-old who was the oldest, oh, tell me what you did, today. And he'd say, oh, I played with so and so, or I watched this. But when he was 5, he would start to reciprocate that question. Dad, what did you do today? I'm like, typed on a computer, right? Like how
Right.
do you talk to a 5-year-old about fighting eminent domain because grandma down the road is getting hosed by her city, Like how do
Right.
you simplify these complex ideas for kids? So I literally went on Amazon and I'm like, there's potty training books, there's birds and the bees, there's like books for everything. Surely there would be books to talk about, constitutional principles or markets or the political process or whatever. Because I thought then I could find that book and read it with my kids and kind of say, hey, this is kind of what dad does.
Yeah.
There was nothing. This was 2014 or 2013 when the idea formed. So, a buddy of mine who's our illustrator, Elijah, he and I kind of cooked up this idea that like, what if there was a book like this? And so we worked on a book. It did modestly well. It was just self-published, just a fun little side project, but enough people bought it where we're like, hey, should we consider doing another one? And then again and again and again to the point where now we've got books for toddlers and teenagers and curriculum and a game and a podcast and a cartoon and like sold over, I think we're almost at 4.5 million books. We're in a dozen languages. It's like so many families have really clicked with this because they see that there's a lot of issues going on in the world. They struggle to know how to talk to their kids about this kind of stuff, like even inflation. Why do things cost more than they used to? Well, we have a book that's all about money and inflation, and suddenly their kids can understand like maybe why we're not buying as much as the grocery store as we used to, or why
Hmm.
we're having to pay more, and just these real world ideas that I think we boil them down at a simple enough level where kids can understand them. The illustrations that Elijah does are phenomenal. So it actually engages kids' attention. I mean, honestly, like if you sit a kid down, you're like, hey, do you want to learn about entrepreneurship? I was like, huh? I'm not interested. But like, these books, they're
Yeah.
fun. We have little Easter eggs in the drawings and things that kids like finding. It keeps their attention. It's just been a joy to work on, but it was totally organic. It just kind of came out of my own need and talking with my buddy Elijah, and we had no vision for what it would become today. It wasn't like a master plan project, but it's just been awesome. So those are the Tuttle Twins books.
Yeah, I thought well maybe it's connected to the part where you're saying you're trying to changing the hearts and minds from Libertas, well, why not start really early, if you're trying to do that? But sounds like it's just mostly about education first to help parents talk to kids. Has it evolved from there? Like, are there any reactions that you had to create one of the books or anything like that?
I would say the most unexpected reaction is from the parents who tell us very commonly that they learned things in our books that they've never learned before. Like, oh, I was
Hmm.
never taught about this in school, or I never, I didn't know this. And because our books span a wide range, of issues. And so that's been interesting. We've come to see our books not as children's books, but more as family educational resources where
Hmm.
mom or dad and the kids can read together. None of this like, kid comes home from school, hey, hon, what did you learn today? I don't know, like where parents and their kids are disconnected from learning. Instead, it's like, hey, mom, hey, dad, or even siblings. Sometimes older siblings will read it to younger ones. It's like, now you can read together. You're all on the same page with this story. It gives you like a language with which to talk about this idea. I got one of the fun stories I love sharing that I got recently from a dad. He was walking in a grocery store with his 9-year-old daughter, and they're walking down the chip aisle. And he turns, and his daughter's no longer next to him. He looks back. She's back a ways, staring at these chips. And she's like, "Damn, I get it now. What are you talking about? I get it. I get why there's spontaneous order." And the dad is just amazed because they had read like weeks ago one of our books that talks about how pencils are made. The whole story is about how a pencil is made. But the point is that there's no like pencil president. There's no one in charge of making sure that all these resources come together, all the millions of people involved in making pencils. Because if you think of like even the wood, right? The guys, chopping down trees, they need chainsaws, but they don't know how to make chainsaws. They rely on other people to make chainsaws. Well, the
Yeah.
chainsaw guys don't know how to like, melt ore or build roads for their trucks. It's so interdependent. And so it's this concept called spontaneous order. That it's order not through a controlled economy that's like centrally planned, but rather the spontaneous actions of all these people. So this dad is in the grocery store, the chip aisle. His daughter has this aha moment, and the dad is telling me in the email, he's like, I'm just amazed because I never really understood this growing up. I don't think like most of Congress understands, this idea. And here's
Right.
my 9-year-old having these like epiphanies about these complex but important ideas. So those are kind of the moments that we savor with what we're doing because we're really trying to like spark curiosity in kids and get parents and kids talking together as a whole family about these kind of real world ideas.
So what was it? Like she automatically kind of saw, oh, there's a bag involved and the chips and how does
I
she
messed
under
up that
yeah.
part of the story. Yeah,
No, you're fine. Yeah.
that part of the story was that there were like 18 kinds of potato chips. And
Hmm.
so her comment to her dad was like, how do people know which one to make and which one people to buy? There's no one saying, let's only make so much of the ridged versus the ruffled versus the baked, it just works and it kind of self calibrates. And so for her, it was the visual variety of the potato chips and just this
Okay.
kind of abundance that she was staring at that clicked it for her.
That's great. Yeah. I'll have to check those out. I didn't see anything about taxes though, but do you have one that teaches everybody how to do their taxes? Because that's usually the
Oh,
thing you think about, right? That it never taught you in school.
yeah, no, maybe we should. It's
Taxes are
it,
fun.
yeah, well, and it's like we need a simplified version of how to do that because it's just insanely complex. And one of my favorite things to see is like social media videos where it's like a teenager getting their first paycheck, and they're
Right.
like recorded on video and they open up, they're like, what? Like where did all this money go?
Who's
And
this
it's like,
FICA
welcome to
guy? Yeah,
adulthood. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, my wife and I were just talking about that. And everything I found from, I think maybe in even Tuttle Twins, but also Libertas talks about a lot of things talking about homeschooling.
Hmm.
Sounds like you guys love the homeschooling solutions right now across the country. And I think I even saw something like there's a homeschooling is going up across the nation with problems
Yes.
with public education. Can you talk about what's going on there?
So I'm a product of public school. I grew up in San Diego in the 80s and 90s, and but I've been homeschooling my kids for a decade with my
Hmm.
wife. And by me, it's like she does 99% of the work, of course.
Okay.
And and so I'm a big fan of homeschooling because ultimately I feel of it like I can go to the restaurant and have to sit through their process, and or I can use an app. and have it delivered right when I want, get just what I want. Like we're transitioning to this like individualized economy where we have customization and on-demand services, and I think there's a lot of amazing things about that. It's created a lot of jobs, a lot of economic opportunity. I kind of feel the same with education. Rather than my kids, sitting in a classroom being taught the same things in the same way at the same time as every other kid, it's like, well, my kid is an individual. Maybe they're not going to do anything with science. Do they really need to know that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, or like maybe they could just like focus on, whatever their topic of interest is. And so across the country, since COVID, homeschooling has tripled. It's always, been steadily growing. But and of course that doesn't take into account the fact that like for a brief period of time everyone was homeschooling at the very
Right.
beginning when they shut everything down.
Yeah, that was
But
fun.
in the time since, it's tripled. And I think a lot of parents have realized, well, wait a minute, like I see with Zoom school what my kids are being taught. Don't know that I agree with some of that. I have some concerns about it. I don't love that my kids struggle with this or really excel at that. And the system isn't really catering to them. It's like teaching to the lowest common denominator or holding kids back and so forth. And of course, when you're managing tons of kids, it's like impossible to offer an individualized approach to each child for their own education. And so, almost of necessity, the system has to kind of normalize and just treat kids mostly the same. And so, from that like utilitarian sense, it kind of makes sense that that's how it is. But as a parent, like I feel like I don't want my kids to just be sucked into some template and treated like everyone else. My kids are unique. They have, even like as a religious person, I believe they're kind of predestined or they have this path that they need to discover. I want to support them in that journey and help them identify who they are,
Mm.
not put this imprint on them of who some curriculum committee says they ought to be. And like every child needs to memorize this, because I hated that. I hated the pump and dump. I would cram stuff into my head. I'd take the test and then I'd dump it all, right? And I would be the kid that would raise my hand, be like, "Why do we need to know this? Put your hand down. It's on the test." And everything was about the test and it was about the grade and it was so I cheated. I cheated all the way through college because all I learned as a kid was that I had to optimize for the grades and the tests, and that's all that mattered. So I took a
Wow.
shortcut. And, I wasn't having this like rational discussion with my 11-year-old self or my 19-year-old self. It's just what I did and what I chose without much thought. But in reflection, it's because I, as a student, never really had the opportunity to learn what I desired. I never could really focus deeply on the things that I cared about. It was having to memorize stuff that other people told me to learn without context for why I should care about it or how it affected my life. And so cheating for me was a way to just have that path of least resistance to just get through it, get out on the other side. And thankfully for me, after college, as I said at the beginning, I just started reading a lot. I rediscovered my intellectual curiosity. I binged a ton of books. And so in retrospect, I'm like, man, if only I could have had that a decade prior, what would it have been like to be able to pursue all that knowledge and focus on what I was interested in at a younger age? And so that led to our decision to homeschool our kids to afford them that similar type of experience or opportunity where they could be kind of at the driver's seat of their own, vehicle of life rather than in the back seat where someone else is dictating where they go in their own life. So yeah, I'm a big believer that, uh, works differently for everyone. There's a variety of approaches to doing it. Hard, of course, for people who are like a single mom or others, even though it's still possible. But it's worked really well for us, and I think generally for society as a whole, the more we can individualize education, the better.
And did I see something that said that it used to be against the law in most states or across the nation?
Yeah, homeschooling really only became legal in the 80s. Before then, you had compulsory schooling laws that compelled everyone to go to government schools. Then it was like the Catholic schools and others that really loosened things for like the private school, where you can go to a private school instead, and decades passed. But it was really that was it. It was public school or private school, and most people can't afford private schools, so they'd all go to the government
Right.
schools. And it was only in the 80s through a bunch of court challenges led led predominantly by the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, where they started challenging a lot of these laws, and the courts started overturning them until it was like the floodgates opened, and most
Wow.
states legalized it. And in most states, like in Utah, as an example, it's like this in a lot of states. All we did when we decided to homeschool our kids, we downloaded the piece of paper, we signed our name saying, I hereby, withdraw my child from school, and then we sent that paper in. There's no curriculum, there's no standards, there's no testing, there's no restrictions of any kind. We can do whatever we want. And to that, some people might be like, well, how do you know if they're learning? And how do you know if they're, all the nervousness comes in. But every time there's been a test comparing homeschooled students to public school students, the homeschool students always outperform their public school peers. And so,
Wow.
You might be concerned, or one might be concerned that there's no like boundaries around this and safeguards and all the things. But all the data we have indicates that it works better than the highly regulated government school approach that most kids go through.
And so if the only standardized testing would be essentially like college level entry courses, like if they wanted to take the SAT, then there's nothing that says they have to be a high school, to graduate from high school, you need a test or anything?
A lot of homeschool students, or I should say, a lot of like universities and colleges welcome homeschool students with open arms. They don't require a diploma. Some homeschool families will self-certify with a diploma. Oh, the Boyack family, school hereby awards, and some universities have accepted that. But what a lot of colleges recognize is what the data has shown, that the homeschool kids are often, more intentional. They're often more assertive. They're often more kind of productive. They're not just the passive students sitting in school being lectured to. They're the ones out there exploring and building and creating. And so colleges, as a general rule, tend to like homeschoolers and have processes that welcome them as applicants, even if they don't have a high school diploma to show.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking, let's say I have a 16-year-old and he has problems with algebra. How do I have him learn algebra without having like 180 assignments per year that he has to go through that he never turns in, So that's something to think about.
I'll give you a specific example to that because I actually like this topic. I wrote a book a few years ago called Passion Driven Education. And here I got a random stack in my book, so here I actually have it. So passion driven education. I wrote this a few years ago, and to your question or your comment, Toby, about algebra, the whole idea with this is rather than sit kids down and say you must learn algebra, 2x plus y equals what, like, and it's almost like a foreign language to kids. We're making them learn the language of math, to then learn math. Well, what we do, what this idea with passion-driven education is you connect subjects to kids' passions. What literally in the book, I shared the example of algebra with my boy. At the time, he was really interested in Angry Birds. That app where you flame the birds at the pigs and so forth. And so I started teaching him all kinds of stuff about Angry Birds. We explored who's the business behind it, and we're learning about business. I showed him the website. We looked under the hood at the HTML. Here's how the Angry Birds website is built. And now he's like, oh, that's how websites work, but it's connected to Angry Birds. He would write little books for people, his own little like you take a piece of paper and you fold it, a bunch of times and cut it once, and then it's a little, 8-page book. And he would write these little books, and he's practicing penmanship and English, and because he's writing Angry Bird stories. I literally sat him down one day, and we started doing all this algebra, but instead of X and Y, I would use the acronyms of the different Angry Birds. So I don't remember what it is, but like Redbird, right? So it's like 2RB plus 3 equals, Y, whatever. And just the fact that I was using Angry Birds as like the variable, he was paying attention and interested and solving things and asking me questions. When had I sat him down and said, let's learn not like, tune out, not care, whatever. But anything connected to his passion, he was like more inclined to want to talk about. And so it really sparked for me this curiosity of like, wow, I'll have to adapt because like now my boy's really big into Pokemon and no longer Angry Birds. So suddenly the hooks that I need to find to talk to him about, history or, English or science or whatever, I now have to come up with Pokemon hooks that will be relevant. But it's been super helpful and it worked really well for him, even with something like algebra.
Wow. Yeah, that's definitely something for anyone to take a look at. Thank you for that explanation. Yeah. Well, you're connected to politics, and it's October, so I can't stop without asking you about the midterms. You said you're technically a libertarian, but it sounds like you're not really about candidates. But what do you think if you had to say, what you think right now? Like, what do you think is going to happen with the midterms? What are the libertarians' chances across the country this year or even 2024? What are your thoughts on that?
So, yeah, I should clarify. Philosophically, I'm libertarian, but I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party. I'm actually a registered Republican, mostly for pragmatic reasons, just because I'm in a Republican-dominated state, and so I can go to all their conventions and, and so forth. So it's kind of a pragmatic choice. I would likely just be an independent and not. I think parties are just very problematic, generally speaking, and create this like uh, tribal warfare that's just not healthy for our society in a lot of ways. But prediction wise, I think that the Republicans are going to take back the Senate. I think they'll pick up a slim majority. I think it's going to hobble Biden as a lame duck president. I think it's going to weaken him even more heading into the next presidential election. Um, I think that the Democrats are really worried about their chances, not just for the midterms, but the presidential race, because Biden's numbers are plummeting. He's not all there very clearly. No one loves Kamala at all. There's no like bench of good, candidates to step in.
Mhm.
Biden is being pushed by his wife to continue to run, which almost constitutes elder abuse, I feel like. I think Trump definitely wants to run again. I think the GOP is increasingly going to be fractured as a result. But I think they're going to plug their nose. I mean, like DeSantis may have peaked too early. Um, like this far out, it's hard with predictions, but I would predict that Republicans would plug their nose and welcome Trump back, uh, just as like a resolution to inflation and the economy, which is like the top issues for voters. I think Elon buying Twitter back, presumably going to welcome back a lot of these banned conservatives and others, is going to rebalance things, and I think with the Republicans being back in control of the Senate, they're going to have the power to like subpoena witnesses and call hearings. They're going to, get to the bottom of all the Fauci COVID stuff. They're going to keep this like top of mind for voters about all the shutdowns and the problems there. They're probably going to do the same thing with social media companies. Elon's going to like probably reveal that Twitter has been censoring people, and then by implication that Facebook and others are as well. I think that's going to foster a ton of debate. People are going to be really upset about that. Um, so, I mean, chaotic times, but to all my friends who are like, oh, this election is the most important ever, or we've never had things this contentious. I'm like, you do not know your history if you think that things have never been this contentious. They're always contentious. They're always, controversial and so forth. But no, that's kind of where if I had to bet money, that's where I'd be placing some of my chips.
So you don't think right now is like the worst it's ever been, contentious wise? That you would say it's been worse before?
People used to shoot one another. No, it's like we had duels and things. People would physically assault one another. Like this morning, the time we're recording, Nancy Pelosi's husband got attacked apparently with a hammer in his home at 2 a.m. for
I think
someone
I heard
looking
that.
for
Yeah.
for Nancy. No one at this time of recording knows the motive or quite what's going on. But when I pulled up the news this morning, everyone was talking about it, condemning it. Oh my gosh, this is horrible, 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 horrible. That was like par for the course back in the day. There was a lot of violence associated with people opposing one another. You had people being thrown in jail for their dissenting views. I think we have become far too thin-skinned compared to our ancestors, and we see mean tweets or whatever as some barometer of how toxic it's become. And I think again it's historical ignorance to not realize like how tame it is in comparison to the way politics has been long ago.
Hmm. Okay, that's a different perspective than I've heard before. So maybe we're not going to a civil war. Maybe we're already in the civil war, but it's all on Twitter with the mean tweets,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's that is a separate though interesting question about if we if we're going towards that type of approach. I can foresee some kind of secession decades from now where the country does kind of split apart, almost
Hmm.
amicably, although contentiously, because I don't think we are United States of America at all. I don't think we're united in the slightest. We're split right down the middle, and
Right.
I don't know that that can continue for so long. So I do ultimately think there will be some type of division. I don't know what that looks like. Will it be armed conflict? I don't know. I hope not. I kind of doubt it. But yeah, if our civil war is nothing more than social media spats, then let's count our blessings.
Well, I hope things like Elon taking over Twitter and hopefully, everybody on the left doesn't just leave and now it's all of a sudden just the Republican social media. Hopefully that helps, and hopefully your company, Libertas Institute, also helps as well. So tell everyone else, what else is going on. You have any events going on that we will see you guys, or how can we find you guys going forward?
Yeah, so Libertas Institute, as I said, primarily operates in Utah. There's think tanks like ours in most states. If you go to spn.org, that stands for State Policy Network, they
Okay.
have a map there where you can click on your state and find some of the groups that are working in your backyard that do kind of things like we do. So that's spn.org. Then your listeners can find people, as I say, kind of closer to them. And then if you're interested about our Tuttle Twins books, those are all at TuttleTwins.com. So of course we're heading into Christmas season and gifts and all the rest, and so they make for great gifts. We got fun toddler books. We got we got the 1, 2, 3s of the Bill of Rights. We have all these like toddler books where we kind of show. So we got the different amendments here, and the Fourth Amendment, the right to a civil jury, the Seventh Amendment, and just fun, silly little drawings for kids.
That's great. Yeah.
Uh, we're having a lot of fun, and would invite anyone who's interested, come check us out at TuttleTwins.com.
And it's Libertas Institute. I've been saying that wrong the whole
So,
time.
well, you aren't, because it's a dead language, Latin. And when I asked a few linguists when I started the organization, how would they have pronounced it? They said, well, there's two ways, two schools of
Oh, okay.
thought. There's the Anglicanized Germanic, libertas, which most Americans say, like you. You're in the vast majority of people who pronounce it that way. And then think of like the Italian, right? The libertas. And
Hmm.
so I thought that sounded sexier. So we ran with Libertas Institute rather than
Yeah.
Libertas, but
Libertas. Yeah.
90% of people pronounce it like you do. So that's the little party fact when you're in a social event and you want to look cool with people. The Statue of Liberty, her name is Libertas. It's the Roman goddess of liberty.
Oh,
And so hardly anyone knows her name, but that's kind of where we derived the name of our organization, the Roman word for liberty. And so Lady Liberty, her name is Libertas or Libertas.
oh. Well, there you go. So we'll maybe we'll mention that on the beginning and say, yeah, you gotta get to the end to get something
Pop
for
quiz.
a pop quiz. Definitely. That'd be great. All right. I think that's probably our time. So, Connor Boyack, I thank you for joining us today on Unity Now. And it's been a great conversation. And we will follow you going forward and see what's going on. And wish you the best of luck, of course.
Thanks, Toby. Appreciate it.
Okay. We'll end it there. And everyone, have a great day.